They thought it was just another equipment glitch. But the signal that came from the dark cold waters of Lake Superior didn't belong to any machine or nature, and certainly not to man. August 6, 1975, 5:30 a.m. At the former military base Camp Huron in northern Michigan, a duty radio operator picked up a strange low-frequency interference. The signal originated from the northeastern sector of Lake Superior, where a joint Navy-Army Corps hydrographic survey was underway. On the spectrogram, the sound appeared as perfectly timed pulses, spaced exactly 5 minutes apart. It resembled the rumble of a massive diesel engine, but deeper, denser, as if it came from within the lake rather than above it. Initial checks ruled out generator faults. Nearby shipping traffic was more than 30 miles away. No vessels reported distress or technical activity. At 5:45, the sound repeated. 3 more pulses, precise to the second. Then silence. The transmission was logged as non-standard subaquatic origin. By 7 a.m., Navy officers and Army engineers had arrived. A rapid survey mission was launched. At 10:15, a research vessel deployed sonar in near-perfect weather conditions. What they found below stunned the crew. At a depth of 190 feet, sonar returned a sharp rectangular reflection, approximately 130 by 80 feet, with unnaturally straight edges, embedded in the silt where nothing was supposed to be. Charts showed only flat, soft lakebed. Yet the signal was clean and unwavering. Multiple scans confirmed it. There was a structure down there. Technicians who replayed the audio through amplifiers later reported feeling the vibrations in their chests, as if something massive was breathing beneath them. One officer muttered, "That's not our tech." The area was immediately sealed off. A Navy dive team was mobilized. The operation was classified under the code name Deep Echo. None of them knew it would be their last quiet night by the lake. August 8, 1975. The air over Lake Superior was still, unnaturally so, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. The sky hung low and pale. On the pier of Camp Huron, 2 of the Navy's most seasoned deep-water divers prepared for what was supposed to be a controlled reconnaissance mission. Lieutenant Thomas Doyle, 34, and Sergeant Nicholas Sanders, 29, both veterans of underwater salvage operations in the Atlantic, were chosen for the first descent. They were briefed at dawn inside a temporary command tent, away from the rest of the crew. According to official notes, their objective was to inspect and document the structure located at Grid 14N, depth 190 feet, and determine possible military or geological origin. Unofficially, the officers were told, "You're going down to look at something that shouldn't be there." At 10:47 a.m., the 2 divers entered the water from the aft platform of the Navy vessel Seeker 12. Their suits were state-of-the-art for the time, heavy rubber with reinforced helmets, full tether lines, and dual radio systems. The sonar operator tracked their descent in real time as they followed a marked line straight to the rectangular anomaly below. The first 15 minutes went by exactly as expected. Both Doyle and Sanders reported clear visibility for the depth, faint silt clouds, and an unusually flat lakebed. At 17 minutes, Doyle reported visual contact. "I see it. It's clean. Flat. Edges are too sharp. This isn't rock." The sonar image confirmed. They were right above the structure. Then, at minute 22, their breathing patterns shifted. Both divers became audibly slower, their voices on the comms slightly delayed, as if time itself was stretching between transmissions. Doyle said something unintelligible, a string of words broken by static. Sanders asked him to repeat. There was no response. At minute 28, without any warning, both communication channels went dead. No static, no cutting out, just silence. The surface crew initiated emergency retrieval procedures. Tension climbed on deck. The water remained mirror still. 5 minutes later, Sanders broke the surface abruptly, disoriented and gasping. He didn't attempt to climb aboard. 2 sailors had to pull him out. His pupils were fully dilated. He didn't respond to verbal commands. He didn't speak. When medics checked his reflexes, he didn't blink at bright light. He just stared, jaw clenched, as if he was still underwater. Doyle didn't surface. 17 minutes later, Sonar picked up movement below. His tether line was still intact, but there was no response from the emergency tug signals. When they finally pulled him up, he was unconscious, his helmet visor fogged from the inside. There were no external injuries, no signs of equipment failure. His vital signs were stable, but he remained unresponsive. Doyle was rushed to the infirmary. Initial scans showed irregular bursts of activity in the temporal lobe, patterns more consistent with deep REM sleep than with a coma. Yet his visual cortex was overstimulated, firing as if he were experiencing vivid hallucinations. No trauma, no oxygen deprivation, no chemical imbalance. The medical team could not explain it. Meanwhile, Sanders was kept under guard in isolation. Over the next 12 hours, he did not utter a single word. Late that night, a nurse reported hearing a scraping noise from his room. When they entered, Sanders was sitting on the floor, dragging his fingernails along the wall, etching repeating shapes, spirals and angular runes, into the plaster. He didn't react when restrained. By the following morning, the operation had shifted into lockdown mode. Civilian contractors were escorted off-site without explanation. Patrol boats formed a security perimeter across the northeastern sector. All radio channels were encrypted. Communications to nearby towns were cut off. The structure on the lakebed was no longer treated as a geological anomaly. In an internal memo stamped, "Top Secret," the phrasing was changed to "Potential Technological Origin," "Unknown Manufacture," "Unknown Function." From that moment, Deep Echo ceased to be a survey mission. It became a containment operation. And for those who were there on the water that day, one detail remained etched in their minds. When Sanders surfaced, there had been no panic in his eyes, only the vacant, distant look of someone who had seen something no human was meant to see. The morning after the failed dive, sonar teams conducted a new round of scans over the anomaly. Visibility was excellent, and the sonar images were crisp. At 9:42 a.m., the equipment picked up something unusual near the southern edge of the rectangular structure. A small metallic object partially embedded in the silt. It was smooth, perfectly cylindrical, approximately 3 feet long. No anchor, no markings, no signs of corrosion. Within hours, a remote-operated probe was lowered to retrieve it. Footage shows the probe's mechanical claw gently lifting the cylinder out of its depression, turning it under the camera light. The surface reflected like brushed steel, but the alloy didn't match anything in the Navy's database. A decision was made to transport the object to the secure storage hangar at Camp Huron for analysis. It arrived at 4:20 p.m. under armed escort. The cylinder was locked inside a reinforced container and placed in a restricted vault. Only 4 people had clearance. 48 hours later, during a routine inspection, the vault was found empty. The container, the logs, even the camera footage gone. Every security camera in that sector had simultaneously gone offline for exactly 16 minutes, with no recorded malfunction before or after. Power had briefly flickered twice during that same window. Officially, the disappearance was logged as misplaced during transfer. Unofficially, panic rippled through the command structure. Meanwhile, strange behavior began to spread through the personnel on site. A radio operator claimed he kept hearing a low hum through his headset after midnight, even when the equipment was powered down. 2 technicians working night shift near the pier reported feeling an unshakable sense of being watched from the water. A cook refused to work near the shoreline mess tent after describing whispers just beneath the surface. Inside the infirmary, Sanders remained mute. Nurses noted that he no longer reacted to light or sound, but occasionally his eyes shifted toward the lake, as if following something that no one else could see. In the bed next to him, Lieutenant Doyle remained in a medically induced coma. His EEG results baffled neurologists flown in from Chicago. His brain activity spiked in concentrated bursts, like someone experiencing vivid sensory input, despite being unconscious. One doctor compared the pattern to a person dreaming with their eyes wide open. By the end of that week, the perimeter around the anomaly had tightened. Civilian contractors were gone. Military police patrolled the shoreline. Command meetings were held behind closed doors with no written records. The structure beneath the water was no longer discussed in geological terms. The language had changed. It was now referred to simply as the platform. Something had been pulled out of the lake, and then it vanished. What no one could explain was whether it had been stolen, or whether it had simply returned to where it came from. On August 12th, for days after the dive incident, a civilian acoustic specialist arrived at Camp Huron under discreet Navy escort. His name was Dr. Leonard Brady, 41, professor of underwater acoustics at the University of Michigan, a respected scientist who had worked with Navy research programs during the Cold War. Brady wasn't told the full story. The official reason for his deployment was to analyze unexplained sonar disturbances during a hydrographic survey. But the moment he stepped onto the pier and saw the sealed perimeter, the armed patrols, and the veiled urgency in the officers' faces, he understood this wasn't an ordinary consultation. Brady set up his equipment on the Seeker 12, a custom-built low-frequency spectral array that could isolate minute vibrations in the water column. Almost immediately, he detected irregular, rhythmic impacts emanating from the sector above the submerged platform. They weren't random. The pulses followed a sequence, roughly every 3 hours, with subtle variations in amplitude. After several recordings and spectral breakdowns, Brady looked concerned. He requested to double-check the Navy's transmission logs. The frequencies he recorded were below 20 Hz, in the ultra-low range typically reserved for deep-water military communication with nuclear submarines. The problem? No U.S. transmitters were active in that region. There weren't supposed to be any transmission nodes within hundreds of miles. Late that evening, shortly after 11 p.m., Brady sent a preliminary report to the operations tent. According to the radio log, his message was clear and concise. This is not noise. It repeats every 3 hours. It's too precise. He returned to his cabin aboard the vessel to prepare the next set of readings. That was the last time anyone saw him. At dawn, when the crew mustered for routine checks, Brady was nowhere to be found. His bunk was neatly made. His equipment was still powered on, instruments still logging. The small research skiff tied to the vessel hadn't been untied. His personal effects, including his wallet and passport, were in a drawer. It looked less like a man who left in a hurry, and more like someone who simply stopped existing between one moment and the next. A search was launched immediately. Patrol boats combed the shoreline. Divers scanned the area around the vessel. Helicopters circled the sector. There was no trace. No splash had been heard overnight. No disturbance detected on sonar. It was as if the lake had quietly absorbed him. Within 24 hours of his disappearance, activity on the lake spiked. Sonar operators began reporting increased signal strength from the platform sector. Louder pulses, clearer patterns. Several technicians claimed to have felt a deep, chest-level vibration pass through the hull of the ship shortly after midnight. It wasn't recorded by instruments, but it left the crew pale and silent. The base went into full lockdown. The shoreline was sealed. All incoming and outgoing transmissions were filtered through encrypted channels. Civilian communication was cut off entirely. The press was given a pre-written statement about an oceanographic accident involving a private contractor, but no details were released. Brady's logbook, recovered from his cabin, contained only one handwritten note besides his final transmission. A single line scribbled in the margin of a spectral chart. "It's getting stronger." No body was ever recovered. No evidence of foul play was found. But among those stationed at Camp Huron, Brady's disappearance marked a turning point. From that night forward, the lake stopped feeling like water. It began to feel like something was listening back. By mid-August, the investigation shifted from exploration to containment and analysis. The Navy quietly brought in a specialized team of structural engineers from across the country, among them Professor Joseph Calder, a respected hydrostructural engineer from the University of Illinois. Calder had spent decades studying dam foundations and underwater installations. He wasn't told what he was walking into until he arrived at Camp Huron. His team began by examining sonar archives from the first scan on August 6th. Comparing them with the most recent data, Calder noticed something that made the officers in the room fall silent. The platform had moved. Specifically, the sonar grid showed the rectangular structure had shifted 7.5 inches, 19 centimeters, north-northeast compared to its original position. It wasn't a margin of error, the readings were too clean. There had been no storms, no seismic activity, no dredging operations. The lakebed itself was stable. The platform had changed position on its own. Calder's written remark in the official log was brief. This isn't natural. Either it's alive or it's automated. That same week, strange psychological disturbances began circulating among the personnel. A sonar technician claimed he heard a soft white noise through his headset late at night. Not static, but something layered, almost like a whispering chorus underwater. A young soldier reported a recurring dream of a vast, dimly lit hall covered in symbols, submerged far below, where a distant pulse echoed through the walls. Several others described similar imagery without knowing of each other's accounts. Calder's lead field engineer kept a personal journal of daily observations. His last entry read, "Nature doesn't build like this." The next morning, his journal was missing from the locked equipment crate. No one admitted to touching it. It was never recovered. For the first time, the officers stopped calling it the object. Now, in private conversations, they referred to it as the thing. By late August, the atmosphere at Camp Huron had changed. The discipline and routine of the early days were replaced by restless silence. The kind that settles over people who have seen something they can't explain but are forbidden to discuss. The first major disappearance came on the night of August 18th. Lieutenant George Pearson, a 36-year-old officer with the Army Corps of Engineers, was assigned to survey the shoreline near the anomaly. He left the perimeter just before dusk, walking along the wooden dock with his journal and flashlight. Witnesses saw him at approximately 8:50 p.m. near the water's edge. At 9:10, when he failed to check in, a search began. They found nothing, no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away. His boots and cap were left neatly at the end of the dock, as if he had stepped out of them voluntarily. The lake was perfectly still that night. No one heard a splash. The next morning, a patrol boat located Pearson's journal drifting a mile north of camp. Strangely, the pages were dry, the ink unblurred, as if it had been placed on the water rather than dropped in. The final entry, written in a clean, deliberate hand, read, "I hear it. A voice. Deep, not in my ears, in my bones. It's not technology. We're not the first." His body was never recovered. A few days later, a technician working night shifts near the generator refused to return to duty. He told his commanding officer that the voices in the water had ordered him not to start the equipment. When questioned, he insisted he had seen something in the reflection of the lake. Not his own face, but another, moving independently of his gestures. He described it as looking back, waiting. When he was found the following morning, he was sitting by the shoreline in complete silence, hands folded, staring at the water. Medical personnel transported him to a military hospital in Chicago. His report was marked classified and sealed. In response to the escalating incidents, the research team deployed an experimental density analyzer, a cutting-edge device brought in by Professor Calder's group. Its purpose was to measure minute changes in the composition of water layers around the platform. The device was lowered from the Seeker 12 late at night, when the lake was at its calmest. 8 minutes into the descent, the live feed displayed a distorted, shimmering surface directly above the platform. The readings showed fluctuations too regular to be turbulence. The lakebed itself seemed to vibrate, producing waveforms unlike anything previously recorded in freshwater. The technician operating the device described it later as watching something breathe, but the lake was the lungs. The results were classified immediately. The analyzer was pulled back up, sealed in a crate, and sent to an undisclosed lab. Crew members were told not to speak about the incident, but whispers spread fast in an isolated place. Some said Pearson had heard that breathing before he vanished. By the end of that week, the fear had changed shape. It wasn't about what they saw anymore. It was about what they heard. August 20th, 1975. At 7:15 a.m., a two-man Navy dive team made a routine descent toward the platform. Visibility was unusually clear that morning. No silt clouds, no current. But what they found below was anything but routine. At approximately 25 minutes into the dive, one of the divers transmitted a brief, shaken message. "It's open. There's a corridor. Stone walls. No seams. And light. There's light, but no source." The divers described a narrow, perfectly symmetrical passageway cut into the platform's surface, descending into darkness. The interior surfaces looked ancient, carved from stone rather than metal, yet smooth as if machined. Their helmet lamps were unnecessary. The walls themselves emitted a dim, cold glow. Before the team could proceed further, communications fractured into static. The tether lines trembled as if caught in a current that didn't register on instruments. The divers were ordered to abort and return. They surfaced visibly shaken, their breathing erratic, refusing to give further details on what they'd seen. Within hours, the camp began to malfunction. Clocks on synchronized devices started drifting, some gaining minutes, others freezing entirely. Power fluctuations struck without cause. Radio channels filled with bursts of white noise. 3 soldiers experienced sudden nosebleeds, and 2 officers reported temporary facial paralysis that lasted several minutes. Medics couldn't find any physiological explanation. Equipment that had functioned perfectly the day before began to fail simultaneously, as if something invisible was moving through the systems. That evening, reports arrived from a fishing village located several miles down the shoreline. 2 local fishermen had gone out the previous night and failed to return. Witnesses claimed to have seen a red glow beneath the water's surface, steady and circular, like a lantern buried deep below. Patrol boats were sent but found nothing, only an unnatural silence over the lake. Meanwhile, sonar teams monitoring the platform recorded a sudden drop in the lakebed beneath it, nearly 10 feet in a matter of seconds. The hydrolocators didn't detect an explosion or seismic shift. It was as if the bottom had collapsed inward, revealing an empty space below. Moments later, the readings stabilized, but not to the original level. One engineer wrote a single line in his field journal that night. "It's breathing, responding to sound." The phrase circulated quietly through the camp, whispered among technicians and soldiers who refused to approach the water after dark. What had been treated as a mysterious structure was now spoken of in hushed tones, as if it were a living thing. By the end of that day, something had broken in the camp's collective composure. The men stopped asking what the platform was. They started asking when it would respond again. By the end of August, the camp had transformed from a research outpost into something closer to a quarantined military zone. Armed patrols circled the shoreline. Lights were kept dim at night. Radio chatter grew sparse, replaced by tense silence. It was during this uneasy calm that a man in civilian clothes arrived at Camp Huron. He came unannounced in the middle of the afternoon, accompanied by 2 armed officers from a classified division. He didn't give his name, rank, or agency. His credentials were presented briefly to the base commander, then locked away. For 4 hours, he remained in the command tent with the senior officers. No one outside was allowed in. After he left, 2 things happened almost immediately. Professor Calder's personal notes and calculations, including schematics and hand-drawn models of the platform structure, were discovered missing from the archives. The primary probe array, a 600-pound underwater sonar package, disappeared from its secured storage shed overnight. There were no broken locks, no tracks, no signs of forced entry. It had simply vanished. Meanwhile, in the nearest village, strange complaints began pouring in. Residents described a persistent ringing in their ears, vivid nightmares of being underwater, and animals acting erratically. Dogs stopped barking and refused to enter their homes. Cats stared at empty corners for hours. Farm animals became restless at night, pulling at their restraints, eyes wide. The local doctor filed a report with county authorities, who quietly forwarded it to the military. It was stamped, "Not for civilian release." Back at camp, a metallic cylinder, identical to the one recovered and lost earlier, was found floating near one of the patrol boats at dawn. It was dry, cold to the touch, with no signs of oxidation. The object was locked away in a reinforced vault under double guard. 48 hours later, it vanished again. No alarms, no tampered locks. The vault was intact, the keys accounted for. The cylinder was simply gone. That same night, something even stranger occurred. The buoy marking the platform's position began to drift on its own, slowly sliding 20 meters north despite the absence of wind or current. Sonar scans revealed why. Beneath the platform, the instruments picked up a massive arched tunnel, roughly 100 feet wide, extending horizontally beneath the lakebed. Its symmetry was too precise to be natural. The chamber seemed to pulse faintly on sonar, like a heartbeat. The incident shook the remaining scientific staff. Some whispered that the tunnel was a mouth, opening wider each night. Others believed it was a passage, a way in or a way out. The next morning, one of the electricians failed to report for duty. He was found at dawn near the shoreline, sitting upright, eyes open, unresponsive. His pulse was steady, but he didn't respond to light or touch. His face was streaked with dried blood from a spontaneous nosebleed. He was airlifted to a military hospital. No further information was released. From that point forward, night watches were doubled, and floodlights were trained permanently on the water. But many in the camp had stopped believing the lights would help. Something below the surface was moving, and for the first time people were starting to die. On August 27th at 3:42 a.m., seismic stations in both northern Michigan and Minnesota recorded a single, sharp underwater jolt beneath Lake Superior. It wasn't an earthquake, the wave pattern was vertical, not lateral, and there were no aftershocks. Soldiers stationed at the shoreline described the sensation as a deep, muffled thud, like something heavy shifting far below. For a moment afterward, the lake's surface rippled outward in perfect concentric circles, though the wind was dead still. Within days, night patrols began reporting strange behavior among personnel. Soldiers standing watch by the water were found sketching identical patterns on their notepads and the walls of their tents, spirals, arches, and single unblinking eyes. None of them claimed to remember doing it. When questioned separately, their drawings matched with uncanny precision. Military psychologists were flown in. Their official assessment labeled the incidents as shared stress reactions, but the reports were classified immediately afterward. The men who drew the symbols were quietly reassigned inland. At the same time, the commander of the operation, Colonel Walter Savage, disappeared without a trace. He had been increasingly isolated in the final weeks, eating alone, avoiding meetings, sleeping in a separate tent away from the command post. When officers entered his tent after he failed to appear for a briefing, they found his cot untouched, his personal effects neatly arranged. His sidearm was still in its holster. His field journal lay open on the desk. The final line, written in a shaky hand, read, "This is not ours. I begged them not to touch it." Savage's disappearance left the camp leaderless at the worst possible moment. The situation reached its breaking point on the night of September 10th. Shortly after 1 a.m., radio operators picked up an intense signal from the platform's coordinates. Not the usual rhythmic pulses, but a rising, oscillating frequency that seemed to shake the entire base. Soldiers described feeling the vibrations in their ribcages, like a subwoofer under the ground. At 1:27 a.m., sentries spotted a pale, milky column of mist rising from the exact center of the lake. It shot straight upward, holding its shape against the windless night sky. Floodlights reflected off the vapor, revealing its edges, smooth, almost geometric, as though it were being held in place by something unseen. A low, rhythmic hum rolled through the camp, deepening into a pulsing roar that bypassed the ears entirely. Men clutched their chests. A few collapsed, blood streaming from their noses. Radios jammed. Lights flickered. Compasses spun wildly. Panic broke out. An immediate evacuation order was given toward the northern shore, but nothing worked. Vehicles refused to start. Portable generators shorted out. Even analog watches stopped ticking. Patrol boats launched toward the exit channel were found half destroyed within minutes. Hulls caved inward as if compressed by tremendous pressure. Others simply vanished into the mist. Groups of soldiers tried to flee on foot through the forest but became disoriented. Some were found hours later wandering in circles. Others were never found at all. The column of mist stood over the lake for 47 minutes, pulsing in silence between each wave of sound. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it collapsed inward, leaving only darkness and a mirror-smooth surface behind. The shoreline camp was left in ruins, equipment fried, men missing, and those who remained too shaken to speak. The official logs from that night were later reduced to a single line. Uncontrolled anomaly escalation. Structural retreat initiated. But for those who survived, it wasn't just escalation. It was revelation. Whatever lay beneath the lake had announced itself, and it no longer cared about being hidden. Just before dawn, in the pale light of early morning, a column of light erupted from the exact center of the lake. It wasn't a flare or a reflection. It was perfectly vertical, white, and impossibly bright, reaching upward like a blade through the fog. For 20 silent seconds, every man and woman on base froze in place, their bodies locked in sudden, total paralysis. Some collapsed afterward, gasping as though they'd been held underwater. A few never fully recovered their speech. At first light, military helicopters approached from the south. But as they neared the column's origin, their altimeters and navigation systems went haywire. Compasses spun, pressure gauges registered impossible readings, and analog instruments failed alongside digital. The pilots couldn't descend below 160 feet, 50 meters, without losing control. One helicopter, flown by Lieutenant Pruden, attempted a closer approach. It vanished from radar mid-descent. No explosion, no debris, no distress call. Simply blinked out, never to be found. By late morning, a high-priority evacuation order was issued. Personnel were airlifted out in small groups. Classified equipment was destroyed on site. Demolition teams rigged the shoreline camp with explosives and wiped it from existence. By sunset, nothing remained but scorched earth and a fenced perimeter patrolled by unmarked military vehicles. The official explanation, released weeks later, attributed the events to a series of underwater gas discharges, causing structural instability and communication failures. The public accepted it. Few asked questions. But in the classified archives, the final operational report told a different story. Key phrases included nonlinear dynamic structure, medium response anomaly, indirect contact, unknown origin. The metal cylinder was never recovered. The platform no longer appeared on sonar. The area was declared off-limits indefinitely. In spring 1993, after an unusually dry winter, lake levels dropped, exposing part of the rocky lakebed near the old coordinates. Hikers reported finding burned geometric patterns etched into the stone, spirals, lines, and shapes resembling maps. Photographs were taken and sent by courier to a federal office in Chicago. The courier and the photos vanished en route. No investigation followed. Those who knew the truth never spoke publicly. Many were reassigned, some disappeared quietly. And as the years passed, Lake Superior returned to its usual silence. A cold, endless mirror. But for those who were there, the memory remained. A structure that moved, a signal that grew, and something beneath the water that was never meant to be disturbed. Maybe, they would later say in hushed voices, it's better not to know what's still waiting below.